I've wasted a lot of time thinking that I wasn't good enough to do something. And for as much as I've done, there's so much I haven't done, and so many people I admire that didn't have those sort of self criticisms in their head. And I would, if I would say anything, I would go back and just say, spend less time thinking about it and just start things and take yourself seriously. I think a lot of, my joy is also my curse, because I don't think I took myself very seriously. And luckily, the things I really enjoyed, like skateboarding and playing music, I enjoyed them too much to not do them. But, for anyone who's young, you get one life, and you got to take yourself really seriously and give yourself the credit that you can do anything you put your mind to.
Between all the shows that I've hosted, it's close to 1,000 episodes now. And hands down, if you ask me what was my favorite conversation, you will hear the words Sam Jones come out of my mouth. Sam Jones, if you do not know who he is a Los Angeles-based photographer and director whose portraits of U.S. President Barack Obama, Sandra Bullock, Bob Dylan, Robert Downey Jr., Jack Nicholson, etc., have appeared on covers like Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, Time, etc. He's directed music videos of the Foo Fighters, Mumford & Sons. Most recently, he directed Tony Hawk's Until the Wheels Fall Off. And where I first discovered him was his show Off Camera with Sam Jones, where he had these in-depth conversations with people like Matt Damon, Will Ferrell, the whole freaking cast of The Office. I love this dude. Not only is he obviously super talented, but when I think of the word creative, I think of Sam Jones. He has been unapologetic in his pursuit of the creative world, whether it's through photos or directing or writing his own show, even skateboarding. This conversation was from 2020, but I'm resharing it today because if you recently heard our shift into hearing the stories of creatives, I always return back to this. I return back to his advice at the end of this conversation where he says, take your work seriously, where he encourages us to play and explore and not be so hung up if something works or not, but just throw something against the wall. I hope you enjoy this as much as I have. This is Sam Jones.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that I've always been comfortable in my own skin, but I've always managed to have a bit of a sense of humor about anything that involves stress. I think I can't take anything about work so seriously that it's going to make me uncomfortable, because to me that I feel lucky that I'm just able to do it. And I've always had that attitude that the work that I've gotten and the things I've been able to do, I couldn't have planned it. I think that helps when it comes to doing this. There's no stakes for me in terms of, if this doesn't work out, bad things will happen, because I tend to always figure out the next thing, and it's always surprising. So, but I think that, my previous work before Off Camera made me a lot more comfortable, because I photographed so many people who are considered famous. And so I think the hardest thing for me was getting used to being on camera myself and trying to think about how to be a host but still be a listener. And what I mean by that is that it's easy to have a conversation in a room with somebody, but when you are filming a conversation that's live, there's a sense that you have to be able to lead the conversation to the place you want to go, while also be open to something coming up. But the goal is always to be open to letting it go someplace rather than just controlling it all the way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that, because being a creative person and also being ambitious and having goals and dreams, it's really interesting trying to balance creating something for the sake of creating it because it's something that you feel like is missing in the world and your contribution, and also too detaching from outcome and wanting to push it to be something great and get attention and all of that. And I think you've done so well with that, where it feels like you're creating art, but also too it is capturing people's attention. And I was wondering kind of your perception of how do I move a project forward and get the traction that I want to see, but also to not be attached to outcome like you were just talking about.
I think I don't have that gear of whatever it is, branding or building on something and steering it in a successful direction, which is probably as much of a curse as it is an attribute, because I think that I'm always driven by my own curiosity and my own interest in something rather than, I mean, if I sat down and did the research to find out which conversation topics got the most hits on whatever platforms or something and designed a show around that, it may be more successful in the short run, but I wouldn't be as engaged in that kind of approach. And so I would lose interest. And then where would I be? So, hey, I'm having really natural, organic conversations with people who usually are put up on a pedestal.
Right.
And that seemed to fit for me, and it seemed to be something that the audience liked. But I have to say, I've never been great at someone who could take the metrics and grow an audience and be that calculated about that. And I'm very fascinated by people that can, that really have that brain. But for me, it is, I guess you said art, and I don't know if it's that, but it's certainly, it seems like if you just come from a pure place, then your interest will remain. If my interest remains pure, then I think people can feel that and they respond to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, your career as a whole, wow, multifaceted. You've been able to do so many interesting things. And there's one piece that I was interested in. It's kind of this time where I know you studied journalism in college, and prior to that, you were into photography, you were skateboarding, all the fun stuff, sports, all of that. And you get into college and you find out you have a knack for photography. And then I know you moved on into taking photographs for huge magazines and getting introduced into the entertainment space and eventually directing and so forth. But where was the gap between, okay, I'm in college and I'm doing well at this, I'm going to actually take the leap and pursue this with my career?
Well, I needed a job and I didn't want a normal job. And I've always been someone that's sort of pursuing several things at once. And at the time I finished college, I was also playing in a band. I wanted to live in downtown LA and get a loft. And I just saw photography as the only thing that I did that had a viable chance at someone paying me for what I do, which is funny because a lot of people consider photography to be and rightly so, a very hard career to do. But my other things were, making it as a musician or as a skateboarder. And so this actually seemed rather conservative and stable by comparison. And I think if I would have done a little more research into how hard the career actually was, I may have pursued something else. But I was lucky enough right out of college that some of my pictures got noticed and I was able to get some work. And again, I think when you're young, for me, I was just following the path of trying to keep going forward creatively, but also to pay for things and to be able to live on my own and not borrow money. So it just seemed like every day was, how can I get through each day doing the most fun things that I enjoyed that also helped me afford life.
I know you've mentioned before just this idea of being multifaceted, and a lot of the people you're drawn to are into a lot of different things. And sometimes there's like a stigma behind that where people feel like they've got to go down one particular conventional path and they're not free to explore and follow their intuition and be curious. Is that always a safe path for us to be able to do that? How did you know that you were on the right path and you didn't need to stick to one thing?
I mean, I never did know I was on the right path. I remember specifically a couple times in my career where I was doing one thing and something else excited me more. And so I would do it even though there was no viable income stream from it. One of the examples was for a while, I was going a couple hours north of my house up to this little mountain community and doing a lot of motorcycle riding. And there was a little radio station that only broadcast to the 2,000 or so residents that lived in this odd little mountain enclave. And I went to the owner of the radio station, who also happened to own the gas station and the video rental shop. And I asked if I could do a radio show. And he said, yes. And so I made a radio show in my garage just because I wanted to do it. And it took so much more time than my photography career. Like, I remember I would spend 6 hours a day working on this thing and trying to figure it out so that I could turn in this show for probably 8 people who were listening. with no plan for career advancement or anything. I just did it because I wanted to do it. And it got me free records and that kind of thing. Oh, I'm sorry. The gardener is here.
Oh, you're fine.
That's not good for audio.
If we make it to this 30 minutes without one of my kids running by, it's a miracle. So you're great.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, I say that as an example of it wasn't until I started off camera that some of those radio things I learned on that silly show ended up being something that helped me, so it's always served me well to sort of play. Every time something feels like it's a little bit too, like it's not a challenge anymore, or it feels like more work than it does creative stuff, my mind tends to wander into trying to do something more, more stimulating. And that's sort of how I've run my career so far. The same thing with when I started my first documentary film. It came out of a desire to do something more fun than the things I was doing, for work at the time.
What about building up confidence during that? Because, embarking on something new you've never done before, in theory, sounds awesome. But two, when you might deal with a lot of internal demons, like who are you to be doing this, or you don't know enough, or what if this fails and flops? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's more, to me, that it's actually come up more as I've gotten older because I have more people depending on me, more responsibility, more financial burden, with family and school and all that stuff. That I think when I did those other things, I wasn't as concerned about the outcome because there were no stakes attached to it. When I made my first music documentary, the worst thing that was going to happen is it was going to be terrible. And if it was terrible, no one was going to see it. And if no one saw it, then no harm, no foul. Now it's a little different. If I take on a project, number one, because being a parent, my time is more limited. So you have to choose your project more carefully. And then if they don't work out, it's a little scarier. So back then it wasn't so much a confidence thing. It was more like, well, who's going to stop me from doing this? It's fun and I'll just do it. And if it doesn't work out, then I can do other things.
If you could bottle that up and sell it, I would buy some of that. It's good.
Well, I do think that I never had that personality that I was into one thing, and I think if something turns you on so much, like if you're an actor and you love acting more than anything, if acting is the thing that makes you get up in the morning, then I understand that, because if you don't get to act, then what are you going to do? And then the stakes become really high. But for me, I think that the actual joy is in the newness and the challenge of something. So it's tailor-made. It's not really confidence. It's more like I have to find the next thing. For me, the worst thing is to figure out how to do something and then to sustain that. In terms of like, okay, I couldn't imagine being, I'll give you a bad example, but say a headshot photographer, like someone who photographs actors for their, so they can go out and get jobs. Because once you figure out how to do it, then you're just doing the same thing every day to some extent. And it even got that way a little bit with magazine photography, where once, it was much more complex, but once I figured out sort of how that works, then the most enjoyable part of that job was the idea, like coming up with the idea. And then once I had the idea, then it was just a problem to solve. So for me, I guess those constant challenges are what keep me coming back creatively.
That's good. With opportunity, you mentioned that word a couple of times. There's an element where we need to know the right people and network. And this show, Unconventional Leaders, we're talking about building something from the ground up. So when you're starting off and you may not know people or have these connections, have these opportunities in front of you. I know that your dad was a race car driver and your mom was a stay-at-home and then a therapist, and you didn't really grow up in this world with entertainers. Correct me if I'm wrong. How are you able to kind of get your foot in the door and get some of these opportunities? Well,
it was a long, I think the one thing that gets underplayed always in these stories is how many days, months, weeks, years of experience where, one of my first jobs ever, I had to photograph a parking space. Tom Arnold's parking space. And you think back, it's like, when I first got a job, they didn't even trust me to be around a real, like, human being actor. They're like, you can go photograph the parking space and learn how to deal with the parking space and just learning how to get on the lot at Warner Brothers and dealing with the security people who said, you can stand here, but don't go here. So it's experience. And I can't tell you how many times I was in a position where I felt completely, like I didn't know what I was doing, and trying frantically in my mind to pick up on cues and try to hide the fact that I didn't belong, or that I didn't know what I was doing. And all those things, every one of those experiences gives you a little kernel of how to be in that world. And yeah, I guess it'd be different. I mean, if my parents were directors or actors or something like that, and I'd been used to going on film sets since I was a kid, there would certainly be advantages to that, but there would probably be disadvantages too, because I might be jaded, or I might be, I might not come at it from as fresh of a perspective as someone who'd been there. So, it's one of those things where as you get older, at one point you realize, oh, I'm the most experienced person in the room. Because I think your mindset is always like, there are always people more experienced than us, And I had that experience recently on an off-camera episode where I had an actor in, and she was in her, early 20s. And I thought, gosh, I have decades more experience than this person. And it was a different perspective than it had been in the past. So, there's no substitute for all those years of just putting your head down and learning at the pace that we don't even know we're learning. We're just gathering experience organically.
Yeah. What led you into these long form conversations? What drew you to that?
I always enjoyed the long form interviews in Rolling Stone, and being a musician, I wanted to read anything that would lead me towards craft. Like I was always looking for nuggets or morsels that would shorten that barrier to experience. And there was a book on songwriters on songwriting that I remember reading it to find out, are there common traits that all songwriters have in the way they put a song together, or filmmakers. There were these series on directing, or on, where I just love that long form stuff about craft, where you really got to hear someone trying to work out how they did what they did. I feel like so many interviews with the subject matter I tend to get, which is more larger, iconic people, those conversations are more focused on the experience of being famous, or the experience of being around other people who are at that level. And I want to know the craft more, and I want to relate the craft. If an actor is saying something about researching a character, in my head, I'm thinking, how does that apply to researching something if you're going to write a novel, or if you're going to write a screenplay or whatever. So for me, I guess it's again a selfish thing to want to have someone in a chair that has all this experience and pick their brain for an hour.
What have you picked up and learned in all these interviews?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing that I put together after doing enough of these was that everybody feels and felt going through their career that feeling that they don't belong. I think and I can relate to that. I think when you get into a career that seems magical or not your regular job, that you feel like you're sort of getting away with something because you get to go out to a film set for a day, or you get to have someone else pay for the ability to be able to rent elephants and bring them to a location and make up something out of your imagination. When you feel that way, I think the tendency is to think, this is going to get taken away from me because it's just too good, or it's too lucky. And there's anxiety and there's fear that goes along with that. And that doesn't ever totally go away. And surprisingly, I think it's those very qualities that make those artists so good, because if they didn't have that fear and that anxiety, I don't think they would work as hard or try to access those parts of their brain that allows them to do this work. So that's what I noticed, that among artists, there are people who are really they're really digging deep into their own experience to do something that's relatable to all the rest of us. And along with that ability to dig deep, there's a basic instability that goes along with that, or a basic delusion, or a basic, they say the people who are really well adjusted, they don't become artists because they don't have that great need to express anything, because things are pretty good, Do
you ever deal with nerves still, or are you past that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can ask anyone, especially on the show, people that work around me the most. My my classic move is to like come up with enough questions and topics and ideas for conversation that I would need a full day to explore. And then I sit in that chair right before we start, and I think I'm going to run out of things to say before the hour's over. And that to me is crazy, because I've had 230 examples of why that is all in my head, but yet it still happens every time.
Is that interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know doing something over and over again, even interviews and stuff, sometimes it's easy to kind of get into a routine with it, like you were talking about earlier. And one of the things you talk about is, cultivating a curious mind and being in a curious state and all of that. And when you're wanting to work on your craft and get better and better at something, there is a level of, it being a little bit mundane to get really good. So how do we kind of infuse curiosity into that and let us explore and play a little bit while getting better at something?
Well, I think that for me, even in school, I was someone who I didn't really spring into action until it was up against the wire of, the assignment's due tomorrow and I haven't even dealt with it yet. So I think for me, the main driver of that curiosity is actually putting myself in situations where there's real output. Like I could never practice doing what I do. Like I couldn't, like even with off camera, the first time we did off camera, I had my friend come in who's a very well respected session guitar player who's played on everybody's records from, he played on a John Lennon record when he was 17, and he played with Jackson Browne and Bonnie Raitt and Lucinda Williams, and a great career and a great person to talk to. And in my head, I called it I'm going to test this theory out and I'll bring my friend on. But I treated it exactly like the shows I do now, no different than having Robert Downey on. And when we finished the show, that ended up being episode 1. It wasn't a test. I couldn't replicate what that experience would be like. So to me, I think there isn't any practicing. And I would say, if you flip that around and go, how does that work for other pursuits as advice? I would say for an actor, like, don't go buy a play and read it in your room with your 2 friends. Like, go find some place, even if it's the parking lot of a convenience store, to put on a play, and have an audience. Like, put it out there and have people show up or whatever. That's the only way to practice your craft, in my opinion, is to make it real.
Make it real. What's something you're interested in right now? I know we're in quarantine, and if you're listening to this in 2020, we're all stuck at home. Is there anything that's kind of, stirring with you right now, of stuff you're exploring or researching?
Absolutely. I mean, beyond the normal quarantine pursuits, I've done a lot more cooking, and I'm learning. I'm becoming a much better baker, which is, cookies and cakes and all that stuff. But I've been exploring writing more, because it's something that I'm a very avid reader. And I've written a lot of essays, a couple screenplays, things like that. But I've taken this time to study the craft a little bit more, and am trying to write every day, and specifically to learn how story structure works, and conflict and character. And in that pursuit and process, I've been reading a lot of books specifically about writing. Which is daunting and extremely scary to see. That's a craft that I can sort of do on one level, but it's like anything else. To be a great writer, you have to write all the time, and getting older and having that ticking clock in your head, and how daunting it is to think, I'm going to dive into a new craft, and because when you've done it in a few other areas, like for me with filmmaking and photography, I know how long it takes to get to a place where you're making meaningful things. So but I have enjoyed doing that. I have enjoyed pursuing that a little bit, and I don't know. We'll see where it takes me.
Would it be fiction, nonfiction, autobiographical? Like, what are you looking at?
Some screenwriting and some fiction.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. That's awesome. I could talk to you all day, but I want to respect the time I asked for. I have one final question for you, but before that, where can people connect with you online and watch this incredible show off camera?
Well, the best way right now, because sadly, Audience Network, who's been broadcasting the show forever, they went away. They got absorbed by HBO Max, and they're no longer a channel. As of right now, we're still a podcast, and we're searching for a new home for the show. But we have a website, offcamera.com, that has all 220 shows on it that can be watched on demand. And it's actually a pretty good deal because for $5 a month, you can have access to the whole thing. So that's the best way to do it. Go to offcamera.com. There's some on Netflix, which is funny to say now because they're the first 3 seasons, which seem like so long ago. Those are still on Netflix and can be found there.
Very cool. Very cool. All of that will be linked in the show notes. I wanted to thank you so much for your work. I want to tell you it's been very liberating for someone who is kind of itching to do creative work and always exploring and feeling like, you could never just really pinpoint one thing you wanted to do and just you wanted to do it all. And it's been so refreshing to listen to your interviews and your show and hear about how the people who you think are so much different than you are just like you, and they just chose to move forward and take action. So thank you so much for creating this work and influencing all of our lives. I was wondering, very last question, if we were to go back in time to this young boy who loved skateboarding and baseball and was outside with his friends and hanging out and just doing all the things and probably had no idea what his life was going to turn into, and that he would go this path, this unconventional path. And if you were to just sit with him for a moment and say, young Sam, know this one thing before you venture off, what would it be?
Gosh. I would say that I've wasted a lot of time thinking that I wasn't good enough to do something. And for as much as I've done, there's so much I haven't done, and so many people I admire that didn't have those sort of self criticisms in their head. And I would, if I would say anything, I would go back and just say, spend less time thinking about it and just start things and take yourself seriously. I think a lot of, my joy is also my curse, because I don't think I took myself very seriously. And luckily, the things I really enjoyed, like skateboarding and playing music, I enjoyed them too much to not do them. But, for anyone who's young, you get one life and you got to take yourself really seriously and give yourself the credit that you can do anything you put your mind to. And I don't think I did that enough as a kid. And it took some lucky success and some things to pay off for me to start believing in myself. But yeah, if I could go back, I would just say, take yourself very